sometimes it's very revealing. No? And some manufacturers tell us, it has 15 stops of dynamic range. Fine, we look at it and it has 12. And in the Latitude test, it only shows like 7 stops. Other manufacturers say it only has 14 stops of dynamic range. And those cameras show like 13 or even 14 stops of dynamic range and 10 to 12 stops of exposure latitude. So you see, there's a huge spread. And our mission is to bring like a standard test to this industry where you can compare all the cameras, and we sort of normalize all these claims into our own database.
What's new in filmmaking technology this week? News, reviews, education, insights, opinions, and ideas from the CineD Newsroom with Nino and Johnny Bahiri. This is Focus Check, the weekly Cinetech podcast.
Welcome to this special episode of CineD Focus Check podcast with my special guest, Dr. Gunther Machu.
Thank you, Nino, for this wow introduction. Thanks for having me.
Of course. A lot of people in our audience might already know you. For those who don't, I'll just give a brief introduction. You're the brain behind the CineD Lab Tests.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can just give a little bit of an overview for those who haven't actually, are not so familiar with the lab tests or why and how we do them. Maybe, first of all, why you personally are interested in this, and also why are we testing what we are testing in our lab test, and what are we testing actually?
Basically, the topic of lab testing has started quite a few years ago already. I think our colleague Sebastian started that, doing some tests with the Xyla chart. I will refer back to that a little bit later. And the major interest of us was, for one, to cross-check the claims of manufacturers, because manufacturers basically can claim anything about how a camera performs. Dynamic range is, of course, a very important piece of the overall puzzle of a camera. Of course, not the most important piece, but it is an important piece. And we basically thought, is there a way to test dynamic range? Of course, there are some norms and standards out there for photographic gear, for instance. But we felt very early on that those tests are maybe not so representative of a moving image like we have with cameras.
Why does it you personally, why are you interested in this? And where, because people might want to ask, who is this guy?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I have a scientific background. As Nino introduced me, I have a PhD in fluid mechanics, which is not necessarily related to camera testing. But of course, I have a scientific mind, a very technical or high technical interest also. And I have a big passion for cameras.
And you are, by films. Your main job, you're
my main job
engineer,
is different.
Right?
I'm an engineer. My main job is basically I'm managing a group at a company that works in the industry, and so I'm having a technical position there.
In construction industry, basically.
It's basically a component supplier for equipment that is used in various industries across the globe. It's a niche player. It's actually very nice to have that job, but of course my technical mind is always working, also off time. And I have a big passion for filmmaking and cameras. And I was personally interested, from which would be the next camera that I would buy to basically check, okay, how good are these cameras also performing in terms of image quality? And so we started to dig deeper for these lab tests based on the pre-work that Sebastian started. And we found actually that it's not so easy to test the dynamic range of a moving image. Because if you think about it, you can very easily identify a clipping point. When the image clips, everything goes to pure white. But even that is sometimes confusing to our readers, because the clipping point, I'm just repeating this, can be at various code levels. Clipping point basically means that the red, green, and blue channels, RGB, they all have the same value, but it doesn't mean that they all clip at 100%. They can also clip like a luminance of 50% or so. But it's clipped, the image. Normally you can identify that easily. But how about the shadows? How about the noise floor? And here we had to find and apply some criteria because there's no standard for moving images. We had to find a criteria how is an image that is already noisy, very much in the shadows, at what point will it be so corrupted that it's not a usable image anymore? And we started at some point to use a so-called signal-to-noise ratio. That's a typical measure that is also used for photography gear. But the signal-to-noise ratio basically describes, do you still have a strong signal compared to the noise floor? And if you look at our homepage at CineD.com at the lab tests, you can see we always supply a waveform. And this waveform basically shows you the spread of or the recording range that the camera can record from the highlights towards the shadows. This is typically done with the so-called Xyla chart, which has a number of patches going from very bright to very dark. And here you can clearly see in this waveform chart where the noise floor starts, because that's basically the base of the waveform image, and stops from the Xyla chart that are already into the noise floor are typically the stops which have a signal to noise ratio of 1, meaning the strength of the recorded signal, the image, is equal to the strength of the noise. And so the question is, which noise levels at the end of the day are still acceptable? And this is also why this dynamic range testing, you can always criticize it and you can always find something or find a hair in the soup. But we said, okay, we want to standardize. We want to have a very standardized test using always the same lenses, using always the same methodology, and we want to compare cameras. And if you find a hair in the soup the way we test it, at least we have a very nice, over the years, a very nice database of all the cameras where we can compare. And not surprisingly, the top-end cinema cameras like the Aris, they are always on top of our testing. And then we have a ranking supplied in our databases how each and every camera performs.
Just to interrupt a little bit here, the starting point was really that we were frustrated by the claims of manufacturers, which are completely, they are always claiming 15, 16, 17 stops, and it sounded very random. And in reality, when shooting with those cameras, we knew that there must be something wrong, because there are massive differences in terms of how latitude, like how the spread is actually, the dynamic range is what are you able to record in, like what's the brightest and darkest spot in an image, and there are huge differences amongst cameras, even though the claims by manufacturers often did not actually match what we were seeing, even before we started doing the scientific tests, the lab tests, right?
Exactly.
And that was basically the starting point of why we all were interested in actually putting an end to this, and we didn't find anybody else doing this in a proper way, and that's why this lab test standard was established. But you were talking about dynamic range, but maybe you can also explain a little bit what the problem is with dynamic range measurements, especially with modern cameras now, and why we are actually also doing the latitude test.
Yeah. Typically, as I have explained, it's all about which signal to noise ratio is still acceptable. Now you have a problem, because if you think about it, at the signal level, you can, for instance, rather easily identify the signal is sort of the amount of light that hits the sensor, and then you have the codec and how it is then finally landing on the card. But the signal level, basically, you can average. It's rather clear. But noise is random. Yeah? And so noise, per its very own definition, should have no correlation. But you can influence noise by doing noise reduction. Yeah? And so what you do is typically, with noise reduction, the signal level sort of stays the same, but you are averaging out by noise reduction some of the noise, and the signal to noise, that's a ratio. So if the denominator, the noise, becomes smaller, all of a sudden, the dynamic range becomes, or the perceived dynamic range becomes better. And of course, if you think about it also in practical terms, you have a very corrupted image by noise. You apply noise reduction. If you can still pull out something a usable image out of the noise, then it's fine, that it's acceptable.
Then the noise is not such a big problem.
Then the noise is not such a big problem.
And it's actually what a lot of camera manufacturers do already in camera, right?
Exactly.
The built-in noise reduction.
There's a built-in noise reduction. So with our IMA test, shooting the Xyla chart, and then we have a software that basically analyzes the patches of the waveforms, and it's a mathematical calculation. It calculates for each of the stops in an automated way the signal-to-noise ratio. And our criteria is that we typically look at the signal-to-noise ratio of 1 and signal-to-noise ratio of 2. But the more noise reduction a camera has per default, the better the results of perceived or of dynamic range will be from this analysis at a certain threshold, which, for instance, is signal-to-noise ratio of 2.
So the noise reduction kind of tricks the IMA test.
Yes.
And of course, more and more modern cameras, including, we tested the iPhone 15 Pro, and also, the 16 the test is not out yet, but for example, they have a very heavy amount of noise reduction, which in theory would, like in the IMA test result, it looks like it has a great dynamic range.
Exactly.
But it's not actually the case. It's just they are applying a lot of noise reduction, right?
And the interesting part about this, we realized it pretty early that the noise reduction sort of plays a huge role. In a sense, IMA test is measuring also the amount of noise reduction. Of course, you have some parameters that you can look up. There's, for instance, in this whole IMA test result that we always display when we show our results. On the lower right-hand corner, you also have like a chart that shows signal amplitudes going to very fine details. And typically noise also would smear out the fine details, so you can also get an impression, is this camera using a lot of noise reduction to achieve these results or not? But at one point we said we also need some sort of a standard real-world test. And so we set up our studio and have a certain amount of lighting, a certain amount of light ratio from the subject to the background and so on. And we do our so-called Latitude test, as I mentioned. And this test basically torture tests the whole image pipeline, the signals coming from the sensor, the encoding, and then how it is, the internal processing, and how it then finally is recorded on a card.
And essentially we're under and overexposing the image, and then you're trying to normalize it again to push it or pull it so it's still properly exposed again, and then you look at how many stops over and under it's actually breaking apart, right?
Exactly. So we have a sort of a base exposure that is typically at 60% luma levels in the waveform at the forehead of our subject's skin. And then we overexpose and pull it back to the base exposure, and underexpose and pull it back to the base exposure. And of course, the overexposure test, you can easily identify when the image clips, but it gets very interesting for the underexposure, because there we go to very, very high levels of underexposure. Of course, in normal shooting, you wouldn't do it, but we also want to see what the cameras are capable of. We go to 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8 stops of underexposure and pull it back to base. And here it really is revealed how well the whole image pipeline, from acquisition at the sensor, analog digital conversion, internal processing, maybe internal noise reduction, and then codec performs. So in essence, that's exactly what we are interested in finally as a filmmaker.
So it's really revealing what the manufacturers are often trying to hide, right?
Yes. And the funny thing about this is, even though they may apply a lot of noise reduction, so they get a good IMA test or mathematical result for the signal-to-noise ratio threshold, in the underexposure test, and if you push it back, the image will break if a lot of internal noise reduction is done, because there's simply not much addition you can do and to work with. And typically, if you then pull up a very heavily processed signal, reduced signal from the noise floor, it typically breaks apart. And this is very revealing. And there you see the clear differences between the cameras also.
Yeah. And that's why, all the results of the dynamic range test, of the and of the latitude test, and of the rolling shutter test, which is also the third test we do, right? We test how good or bad is the rolling shutter in a camera. We put all those things in our camera database, which allows you to actually compare results and also look at individual results. We can maybe show it a little bit later. But you also, it's very important that for the major cameras, you're writing long articles explaining, because of course there are always nuances, right? You're finding different strengths and weaknesses in different cameras, and it makes sense to not just put out the data, which is important, of course, to compare it, but also to just write down your findings. And this year, and we do a little bit of a year in review here, this year meaning last year in 2024, we released 7 articles, like 7 lab tests of different cameras. Let's say 8, because one of them was released in December 23. So let's just include that. So let's say 8 of those we released. I mean, it's always a cat and mouse game, right? You're always we're always behind because there's more and more cameras being released. You're also still working on some of those we already tested. You're still doing the post-processing, right? And we will release those very soon or whatever in the next weeks, months. But let's talk about the 8 that we released and do a little bit of a year in review. And I'm very curious to hear your, like, what did you expect from 2024 in terms of camera releases and the sensor quality, and what did we actually get? I'll just do a little bit of a summary here of what we did release. The first one we released was the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K lab test. That is their full frame
exactly.
pocket camera. Essentially, they dropped the pocket, but it's essentially still the pocket form factor. We released that like a year ago in December 23. Then we released a lab test of the FUJIFILM GFX 100 Mark II, which was also highly anticipated. Of course, a large format, in photography terms, medium format camera with a very large sensor. Then we released the Sony Alpha 9 Mark III, which is interesting because of the global shutter, especially.
True.
Not predominantly a camera targeted at filmmakers, I would say, but still interesting because of the global shutter. Then you also tested the Red V-RAPTOR X 8K VV, which is of the VistaVision, which is of course their top line camera. So very interesting in comparison to the Alexa lineup. Then also Sony Burano 8K, Komodo X lab test, then the Panasonic Lumix GH7 that was only recently, and last but not least the Blackmagic URSA Cine 12K LF, which is their first high-end, I would say, cinema camera. But before we dive into each one of those, I mean, any surprises, like when you think back a year or a while back in general, was this a particularly good year in terms of like advancements of sensor technology, or is it something you already expected from? I mean, looking back a year, we had the Alexa 35 the year prior and some other things which were very good. But at 2024, what stood out for you?
Basically, I think the global shutter sensor technology stood out for me because in the past, global shutters had like this saying that they are sacrificing dynamic range for having the global shutter, meaning they read out all the sensor values at once. But the contenders that we tested, like the Sony A9 III or the Red Komodo X or the V-RAPTOR X, all three use a global shutter sensor. I was very surprised about the good results those cameras are giving. And for me, it was a little bit of the dawn of the age of global shutter sensors. And I had actually hoped to see maybe more cameras coming out with that, but also on the lower end, like for instance, Sony Alpha line. But maybe we'll see that next year. Let's see. But the second thing I was surprised is the latitude of some of these cameras, because what we could see is that, for instance, the Sony Alpha cameras in the past, they had rather good image test results, probably also due to their internal noise reduction. So they had always like around 12 stops for full frame sensors at signal to noise ratio of 2, which is in principle a very good result. But if we look at the latitude tests, they only managed to pull off between 7 some of those could pull off 8 stops like the Sony A1, 8 stops of exposure latitude. And that is like 4 stops less than the Alexa 35 that you just mentioned. So cameras, the top-end cinema cameras are able to pull off 3 to 4 stops more than the typical consumer cameras in the Latitude test. And what we could see this year, 24, is that some of these cameras like the A9 III, global shutter, full frame sensor, they managed to pull off 8, if not 9 stops of exposure latitude, which is like at least 1, if not 2 stops more than we were seeing in the past, meaning that the whole pipeline, sensor, internal processing, and codecs have improved a lot. So I would say not the absolute dynamic range figures this year. There wasn't any surprise for me, but actually the usable image in terms of latitude has improved. And that tells me that the manufacturers basically took it serious and worked a lot on their image pipeline to make that better. And that is a fantastic result for us, because that's what we finally use as filmmakers. I mean, a result on paper of an IMA test is fine, but I'm really interested in the latitude results.
Is there any individual item where you think they improved the most? Like, is it the sensor? Is it the processor behind the sensor? Because I think this year we've also seen a lot of camera releases in general. Not necessarily, I mean, many of those we didn't put in the lab because we didn't deem it interesting enough. But I think we're seeing a lot of camera releases which are using the same sensor as a prior model.
Exactly.
And then just improving the processing behind it. But that often does influence something like noise floor,
of course,
and stuff like that,
of course.
right?
Yeah. I mean, in general, we have to say that if you come from the photography world, you're used to 14-bit raw images, sensor readout. In the video world, all these sensors are not capable to deliver the higher frame rates that are needed for video in 14 or even 13-bit. So the typical consumer camera and also higher-end cinema cameras, they use a 12-bit readout, or 12-bit is that what you get in a raw file from these cameras. And I think this is one thing where sensor technology might improve next year, where I was a bit disappointed that we did not see it in 24, is higher bitrate readout. There's only one example that I'm aware of. It's the FUJIFILM XH2S that up to 30 frames per second has a 14-bit readout mode of the sensor in video. And this camera also performed very well in our lab test. We tested it already in 23, but it shows like around 9 stops of exposure latitude, which is really good. So actually looking into the future, I think we might see more and more 14-bit sensor readouts, and that means we will see another jump in the absolute dynamic range figures, because for the absolute figures, this year was a bit disappointing in the sense, due to the readout nature of 12-bit, we are also not seeing much more than the 12-13 stops of dynamic range that we see in all the cameras.
So you're saying that 12 bits
sensor readout.
Sensor readout is essentially becoming the bottleneck, right?
The limiting factor, exactly.
Because I think in the past we've seen, before we had CF Express cards, we actually had slower memory cards, right? Which meant that the codecs that a lot of manufacturers were using were limited, or that's what they said, were limited by the speeds that those cards could record, often SD cards, or, you know, like one of those generations of SD cards that are out there, but they're always somehow limited. And now essentially even Ari is using CF Express Type B cards in many cameras. So or in more, I think it's in the Alexa 35, and it's probably going to come into other cameras as well. But so it seems like that standard is now fast enough to record also raw. We've seen it also with Canon cameras and so on. Do you see, compare, like, as an overview, we know that, for example, Sony, except for the Burano and Venice, they don't actually do raw internal recording yet for video. But Canon does it for the... Well, we haven't released a lab test yet of the C400, but it uses CF Express Type B.
Yes.
Do you see any correlation of now having this card standard in more modern cameras with the actual quality of the footage on the, or the codecs that's capable of being recorded in terms of bit rate and also the latitude and dynamic range?
Yeah, I mean, as a general summary, I think we can say that sensor technologies sort of stayed the same, but the whole rest of the image pipeline, like the codecs, the RAW that is recording in 12-bit, those kind of internal or external possibilities have basically catched up massively. This is also why we see much better latitude results for some of these, exposure latitude results for some of these cameras. But we haven't seen the jump in sensor technology. This jump we only saw in super high-end cameras like the Alexa 35 that we tested already the year before. Those cameras use different technologies to basically get higher dynamic ranges. So I'm actually expecting now with the codecs and the internal image pipeline having catched up, now the sensors again need to make a jump to give us better results in the future.
What are those technologies that Red and Ari are employing in those high-end cameras? It's essentially a type of, I forgot what Red is calling it, but it's essentially a kind of almost double exposure, right? They're kind of fusing multiple exposures into a higher dynamic range image, which also comes with its downsides, especially with a Red, if I recall correctly.
We have to distinguish between different types. There are different methodologies by which the manufacturers are achieving higher dynamic range. If you look at the normal sensor readout, one trick that some of these manufacturers like Red are using also in the Blackmagic cameras, you can do it in post. With the Red cameras, it's baked in the image. That's the highlight recovery method. That's one method where you basically reconstruct already partially clipped image channels, like if you have a clipping red channel, for instance, based on the luma value, you can still make an estimation of the red because of the red channel because there is a correlation between red, green, and blue, and then you can make an estimation and try to reconstruct one of the partially clipped channels. And this so-called highlight recovery brings you in the highlights about an additional stop. The Red cameras do it by default on the new models, and also in Blackmagic cameras you can do it in post and have this highlight recovery option, and that gives you another stop of highlight capabilities.
But it comes with some downsides.
The downside is that those recovered stops obviously don't have the color accuracy. And this is why Red, for instance, takes out the saturation, that it's not so obvious. But you see it, for instance, with Blackmagic cameras, also the color accuracy suffers. If you clip, for instance, a skin tone, you see it immediately. It becomes yellow, it becomes yellowish and doesn't have this natural appearance anymore. That's the expense of this technology. Then there's another technology that you do double exposures. You do, for instance, one exposure at, 1/50th of a second. And then you have, depending on the method used, you can do like 2 or 3 stops. For 2 stops, that would mean 100, 200. Or the Red cameras do 3 stops of exposure merging. So you have another image recorded at 1/400th of a second. And then you merge the 1/50th of a second with the 1/400th of a second image. And this gives you 3 stops more highlight latitude if you want. But the problem is that you are merging 2 images, that the one has like motion, how you call it?
Motion blur.
Motion blur, thank you.
So it's a problem whenever something is moving.
Whenever something is moving. Yeah. In software, you have to sort of add motion blur to the 1/400th recorded image. And you still see it. Yeah. I think this is why also we never used it in our tests, because it's sort of a merging, it's a gimmicky thing.
But you can use it. I mean, if you do like a very static thing or a sit-down interview or something, without maybe, let's say you shoot an interview in front of a window, right, with a blown-out window in the background. That's something where you could probably use it because the person in front will hopefully not gesticulate very quickly. But if it's just a normal interview, it should just work.
It should just work. Yeah. And then there's another technology that the Canon, for instance, uses in their C70. That's the DGO, dual gain output technology, which basically runs the sensor with 2 different gains or ISOs, if you want to call it. And then you merge the 2 different gains of the ISO into one image. And this technology has the advantage that you don't have to mess with motion blur, because the whole sensor is recorded with the same exposure in terms of the shutter speed, but you merge two different gain levels of the sensor. And something similar seems to be happening with the Lumix, recent Lumix cameras like the GH6, where it was called dynamic gain, dynamic boost, dynamic range boost on the GH6, and the GH7 has it already implemented per default. You cannot.
Interesting. So basically, that's like it's like dual native ISO recorded at once.
At once, yeah.
Okay,
sort of.
And
and then there's a last technology where already in the analog digital conversion gain, ARRI is doing that with the Alexa sensors, where something similar happens, but you manage to gain you add two streams of a higher bit depth. And this is why, for instance, the Alexa 35 has 13 bit of ARRI raw files. So here you can also benefit already of the higher bit depth of a moving image. But I don't know exactly how that works.
But all those things, I mean, you always found out by yourself, right? It's not like the manufacturers are telling us.
Yes
some
and no.
are.
Yes and no. Some are telling us this.
Yeah.
But also here, it's all about the claims and the reality. And sometimes it's very revealing. No? And some manufacturers tell us, it has 15 stops of dynamic range. Fine, we look at it and it has 12. And in the Latitude test, it only shows like 7 stops. Other manufacturers say it only has 14 stops of dynamic range. And those cameras show like 13 or even 14 stops of dynamic range and 10 to 12 stops of exposure latitude. So you see, there's a huge spread. And our mission is to bring like a standard test to this industry where you can compare all the cameras, and we sort of normalize all these claims into our own database.
Do you think at some point in the future it will be necessary to upgrade the test in some way? Because we are, of course, with all those new things we're seeing. I mean, if we just take that, I don't know what they call it, but the red thing where they're actually fusing different shutter speeds, right? That if we were to test that in the Latitude test, we wouldn't actually see the downsides because we don't actually film a moving image in sense like fast movement or any movement really. So, do we have to upgrade? Or also the year before we saw the Alexa 35 was already stretching the limits of what the EMA test chart is actually displaying in terms of the dynamic range it was able to record.
Exactly.
So what's the next step for us in the future,
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because with the Alexa 35, we, as you mentioned, our EMA test, our Xyla 21 chart, it has 21 stops of dynamic range it can display by differently lit patches. And the Alexa 35 actually showed like 15 stops at signal to noise ratio of 2 and around 17 at 1. And there were still additional stops, up to 19 stops visible in the shadows. And you need, for a correct test, you need to clip one stop. That gives 20 stops. So we only had one stop of margin with our test setup.
So we had the limit.
We had the limit, actually,
Stop making better cameras.
Yes.
Okay, so we need a better chart. But we also
have to say, at one point we need a better chart with more stops of dynamic range. But we also have to say the Alexa 35 is so far ahead of every other camera. It's 2 stops ahead of every other camera that we have tested so far. So, let's see what the future brings. I would be happy already if the other camera manufacturers start to catch up with maybe different technologies that we just discussed, maybe higher bit depths, 14-bit readout of the sensors, and then we will also start to see higher dynamic range values again.
But didn't Xyla stop making charts?
Xyla stopped making charts, so at one point we have to think about something else.
Okay. Which leads me also to the other question. Actually, you mentioned the merged exposure technology. But we're seeing, with the most recent Canon cameras, the C400 and the C80, we're seeing triple base ISO, which I found very interesting. And I was saying to Johnny in another podcast before that, could we see in the future, at some point we have cameras where every ISO that you can set it to is a native ISO? Is that possible? Because right now it's I was just again shooting with FX3 and FX6 recently, and it's great to have ISO 800 and 12,800 as base ISOs, but the problem really is this gap is so big. It's such a huge gap that you essentially end up using ND filters indoors with a higher ISO if you want to, shoot at a specific f-stop, and the other one will just be too low without ND. So I mean, and I think the way Canon is going with a triple base ISO is not something I expected, but. Do you think it's even possible? Let's say there's a camera in the market that can do 5 or 6 base ISOs. Yeah. I probably wouldn't even need any other ISOs anymore, right?
That's true. That's true. We have to be a little bit careful with that because I'm honestly not so sure what is really behind this triple base ISO. Because if you look at our dynamic range tests that are already published of the C400, we didn't do the Latitude or didn't publish the Latitude test yet. It is basically losing stops at each of the native ISOs. Yeah, it starts very, very good at the base ISO of 800, and I think what is the second one? Was it 3200?
I don't remember. Yeah, but maybe
we have to look it up. Sorry that we can't remember by heart now. It goes down, and then at 12,800 again it loses significantly in terms of dynamic range. And so far, actually.
Yeah, it's 800, 3,200, and 12,800.
Yeah, okay, so we were correct. Very good. But basically, my understanding of the definition of a dual native ISO or a triple base native ISO was that you're not sacrificing dynamic range. Mm-hmm. And so far, we have seen it, for instance, with the FX9. The FX9 at both base ISOs has virtually the same dynamic range readings in our test. So switching between the different ISO circuits does not change the dynamic range. And I also see it, I know it from my Panasonic Lumix S1, for instance. It has 640 and 4000 as the dual native ISOs. And in our tests, the dynamic range results were virtually identically. You lose maybe 0.2, 0.3 stops or so. But with the C400, we see a massive drop. So that's not really the definition that I have of a native ISO. You have to be aware you lose.
So actually, were Johnny and I a bit too early with our calling them part of our cameras of the year, the C80 and the C400?
No, I think they offer fantastic value for the money. I mean, it's as mentioned, dynamic range is just one piece of a puzzle. There are many other things to consider when you look at the camera. And does it have all the connections? Does it have,
of course,
all that stuff?
No, but just joking. But just saying. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so that's not great. Yeah, because it's just an interesting concept to have these multiple native ISOs. Of course,
it's good that you have like selective ISOs where you can be sure that the noise levels are minimal, but you have to be aware that the definition of a native ISO is a bit stretched sometimes. And we see it in our tests for the C400 as well.
Maybe they should just have one native ISO and then just say, well, the others are there too. They are better than others, but we don't. I mean, it's a market. It's just become a marketing thing to call them native ISO.
To be honest, on the C400 with 12,800, to me, looking at the results at least, it looks like a marketing gag. But of course, we don't know.
Really, also compared to
we don't know what's behind.
The Sony cameras that also have the 12,800?
Yeah.
So it's much more noisy than... Yeah. Okay, interesting. I hope you include that in the written lab test.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe a comparison
I can only talk about what I see. I don't know what's behind inside.
No, of course. But also compare, I mean, because a lot of people are seeing this on paper and they're like, okay, well, Sony has that with the FX6 and the FX3 and so on, A7S III. Now I can have it on the Canon, but it's going to be interesting to actually do a comparison between those 12,800s.
Would be interesting, actually, also in the real world, how they look like.
Are they equally noisy or not? Actually, maybe we should do a real world test of those.
Be interesting,
Good idea. We'll be back after this message from our sponsor.
1 Minute Tips by FUJIFILM and CineD. Eyeballs. They are our number one asset and tool in this line of work. Are you taking care of yours properly? Our eyeballs are very malleable, and their function can shift based on many factors. Generally, the more strain your eyeballs accumulate, the less they are able to flex and focus properly. Most important is make sure you get enough sleep. That helps reset the strain, and your eyeballs work most optimally in the mornings. During the workday, you are likely staring at a monitor for extended periods of time, accumulating that strain. Take breaks as often as possible. Shift focus periodically between far and near distances to keep your eyeballs malleable, and even close your eyes for short periods of time if you can. Hydrate and nourish yourself, because just like any other muscle, the muscles in your eyes also need water and nutrients to function. Lastly, if you wear glasses like I do, look into getting multiple pairs with different prescription strengths based on what type of work you plan to be doing. Remember to stay healthy, stay hydrated. 1-minute tips. Until next time.
And now back to the show. Good. So let's just do a quick touch on each one of those tests from the last year. So Blackmagic cinema camera 6K, full frame. I mean, that was their first full frame camera ever. For some reason, they dropped the pocket, even though it's the same body. And at that time already, people were asking for a box-shaped version of that, which we got later with the Pixies, which we haven't tested yet. Basically, because we think it's going to be the same result. Exactly. I mean, they actually said that it's the same sensor, same hardware, processing. So the Pixies. I mean, maybe if we get it at some point, we'll just do a brief checkup just to verify and just to say maybe it just ends up in the databases, just to really verify that it's actually the same results. But we expect it to be the same results if the manufacturer says it. But is that the full frame camera that people expected from Blackmagic design, in your opinion, in terms of like sensor quality?
I mean, basically, it seems that they used a very common sensor that seems to be also similar, but of course we never know what's inside a camera, similar to the Lumix full frame cameras. And we also see that the results are sort of similar. Of course, you have the big advantage with the Blackmagic cinema camera 6K, that it's recording internally in the 12-bit RAW codec, which the Lumix full frame cameras, of course, don't do. Maybe future versions of them. So I think it's a very, very nice package in terms of image quality. The only sort of Achilles heel, when you compare it to the Lumix cameras, using assumingly the same sensor, is that the second native ISO that the cinema camera 6K brings to the table is much more noisy, and it is rather difficult to get, if you underexpose it, to even in post-production, to get it back to a usable image with noise reduction in post. That was surprising for me because I was expecting, hey, great, looks like it's a similar sensor that we have in the S1, S1H, and we should get superb results even at the second dual native ISO, speaking of. No? But on this camera, the implementation of that sort of suffered compared to other cameras that use that sensor.
And the rolling shutter wasn't great either.
Yeah, this is very similar actually that we saw on other cameras and sensors as well. You could essentially say it's a copy-paste of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K G2 or even the first version. It has very similar results in the dynamic range department, the Latitude results. Rolling shutter is different because the Pocket Cinema Camera 6K uses a Super 35 sensor but it's almost a copy-paste on all the fronts.
All right, and then we released the FUJIFILM GFX 100 Mark II lab test, which of course, I mean, the first generation was already something that a lot of people got very excited about. So finally a large, I mean, now we know they're actually working on a cinema version of that, right?
The Eterna, I think it's called.
GFX Eterna. But this is the version that was released last year actually. And you put it through its paces also in the lab test. Is this immediately, first thing that comes to mind, very large sensor. This must be a low light beast. Is it the low light beast that we were expecting?
Yeah, if you talk about sensor size, you also have to talk about resolution. If you scale up the sensor, but you also scale up the resolution, then the pixel pitch of the individual pixels stays sort of the same. I think what the big strength of this camera is that it has so many recording modes with very good codecs, internal ProRes recording, HQ 422, that you can use like cropped portions of the sensor. You can record in medium format or large format for filmmaking. But you have to look at all these modes because there's always a bit of a catch-22 because you cannot record in the highest resolution using the full sensor area. You have to crop in to get the highest resolution of the video recording. But have a look. basically, we can say that it is sort of state of the art for a 12-bit or usual sensor readout mode. It's not using any special tricks to enhance the dynamic range. Another catch of that camera, of course, due to the sheer sensor size, is its rolling shutter. So be aware the rolling shutter is rather high, so handheld shooting is not recommended with that. But of course, it has a fantastic combination of internal codecs, good image overall. Also in the Latitude tests, it didn't perform that bad. But it's not top of the line what you would get, for instance, with some of the full-frame cameras and also Super 35 cameras that we tested, just looking at dynamic range, rolling shutter, and Latitude.
The rolling shutter, I think, is one of the reasons why some people are worried about the GFX Eterna.
Exactly.
But we were assured that it's not going to be a rehoused GFX 102. So I just want to point that out now, that they're actually working on the processing, and I'm sure they are doing their best to make better results here, because of course, as a cinema camera, you would expect a much better.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the rolling shutter result, I don't know, what was it, like close to 30?
Yeah, 26.5 milliseconds. Yeah. So that's really a lot of wobble if you use that in.
That's basically handheld. You can forget on that.
In this mode, it's getting better.
Then you have various crop modes, but there's also a dynamic range priority mode in this camera. And what I don't know exactly what it does, but typically I think it is, you can make a choice if the whole 100 megapixel sensor is downsampled properly, as a readout and downsampled properly to 4K, for instance. But this is at the expense of reading the full sensor, high rolling shutter, or you have something like a line skipping mode or whatever that is the dynamic range priority off. Then you get much better rolling shutter results, but then you don't benefit from the downsampling of the full sensor resolution. Yeah. So you can make a choice, like a little bit of a less good image, sort of, with higher, with much better rolling shutter results, or the full quality of the sensor, but then at the expense of rolling shutter.
I find it interesting. I mean, their choice to make this into a cinema camera also makes me curious what their plan is in terms of lenses, because there are not actually a lot of lenses in the market that are covering the full sensor, unless you go really, really expensive high end, and then you wonder, like why you could be shooting on the Alexa 65 or the new one 265 already, because you can only rent them anyway. So that's going to be interesting, because I mean, I'm sure a lot of third-party manufacturers will probably race to make something now for the cinema camera, but there's a lot of question marks around that. So we'll be curious to see that cinema camera also in the lab, and how it compares actually to the GFX 102 once it comes out.
Yeah, it will be interesting. I mean, medium format is definitely something. I mean, every company, of course, tries to make something unique, and I think Fuji, with their decision to obviously go for medium format sensors and Super 35 sensors,
and skip the full frame.
Skip the full frame. It's a very interesting positioning of their cameras, and it's only, in my point of view, it only fits the strategic way forward if they try to make the medium format more popular, because they also want to sell lenses and stuff. Fine. The only thing I always feel about, but that's my personal thoughts about medium format, is as long as I do not have fast lenses, what's the point? Because a full frame camera, you have f1.2 lenses for that. And then if you apply the 0.7 factor to medium format to a 2.8 lens or so, you're not better than the full frame with a 1.2.
I mean, you have less distortion. You have less distortion. Theoretically, I mean, that's why architects like to shoot on medium format photo cameras and so on. But it's not something you can't fix in post, right? Essentially, I mean, it has a different quality. It's not just this, but I agree. I mean, it's now.
Even if you look at it, they have some lenses that are f1.7 for medium format. If you apply the 0.7 factor to these lenses, you also are at the full frame equivalent of 1.4 or something.
Maybe they'll position it as a. I mean, I guess the full frame market in general is very crowded. I guess that's why they're skipping, and they already have the medium format technology. The question is, will they position their cinema camera as a maybe medium format camera that is predominantly aimed at full frame shooters, but then you have this extra mode if you want to shoot open gate with crazy lenses, or I don't know, like as an extra thing, but of course at the expense of some things like rolling shutter. I don't know. Yeah. We'll see how they will position it, but it's going to be interesting for sure.
I think having prime lenses with f1.4 or so on a medium format, this could open up a new type of visual
especially the wide angle lenses. I mean, if you the problem lenses, always is wide angle with a shallow depth of field is very, very hard to obtain. Even on full frame, it's like domain. That's definitely something where you could see that different. This isolation in an image, if it's a wide angle, that's something that's still kind of elusive.
That would give like a new look, basically. No?
Yeah, true. All right. Yeah. Well, I will see. I mean, obviously, Ari rushed also out a new version of the Alexa 65 called 265, interestingly. So we'll also try that. It's a rental-only camera. We've never tested the Alexa 65.
No, I never tested it.
I think I'll try to get both the 65 and the 265, right? Should we?
I mean, the interesting thing is, as far as I know, the 65 is based still on the Aleph 3 sensor, which we also have tested with our lab test of the Alexa Mini LF. And it seems to be a stitched-together version of that sensor. So on a pixel-to-pixel or sensor resolution, and we always test the dynamic range with image test and Xyla charts on a pixel level with maximum resolution. If it is the same sensor like the Mini LF, there should be no surprise.
On the 65.
On the 65. On the 265, it seems to be different because Ari claims they did something to the image processing.
It's one stop more, I think.
One stop more, I'm not sure. So it still seems to be on some version of the Aleph 3 sensor because they always said the Alexa 35 sensor, the Aleph 4, they cannot stitch together for a larger format. We'll see. Even if they improved something in the image processing, as of course time moves on, I mean, electronics get better. So I can very well imagine that they've improved the dynamic range even of this older generation of sensors for the 265. But
I mean, it seems to, and also what surprises me that it still uses codecs media and not CF Express Type B like the Alexa 35, right? I think that's CF Express B now. So
so many card options out there. I don't know by heart.
It's like okay, but we'll try to get our hands on it, and
would definitely be very interesting because it's also nice to have a benchmark for our dynamic range and latitude testing. No? It was fantastic when we had the Alexa 35. 12 stops of latitude, 15 stops, signal to noise ratio of 2. It's amazing.
Yeah, good. But we don't have. I mean, that's the thing. I think I don't know if anybody's really waiting for it, but I guess what the Alexa shooters want is a full frame version,
of course,
like a large format version of the Alexa 35, right?
Yeah.
That same sensor.
That would be great.
Yeah. Okay. Then you tested the Alpha 9 Mark III in the lab, which, as I said before, predominantly aimed at photographers, high-end photo camera, but it has a global shutter.
Yes. I was actually very curious to test it because for some reason Sony is not marketing it much as a camera for video enthusiasts or whatever. They always talk about wildlife photography and stuff like that. Of course, it has fantastic features. It can shoot, 120 frames per second in photography mode. I mean, wow, that's huge. The global shutter really stands out for me, and I was super curious to test this camera because on a personal note, I'm also a wildlife shooter, and if you have super long lenses, like from 1000 millimeter focal length onwards, it's super hard to keep the image stable. And you get, even with the slightest movement, with rolling shutter sensors, you get wobble.
Amplifies
everything massively, and the wobble is really distracting in an image. And so this would be a superb camera as also for videography. And so I was very curious to test it. And to my surprise, it is actually the best alpha camera that I ever tested. Because on paper, cameras like the Sony A1, or now the successor, the A1 II, on paper have higher dynamic range figures if we look at the Xyla chart and image test results. But in the Latitude section, actually, and Latitude again, reminder, we do this over and underexposure tests, pull it back, and then the whole image pipeline and image processing is tested. For some reason, Sony did not put much of a default noise reduction in this image processing, which all the other Sony Alpha cameras have, and that's why they get higher dynamic range results on paper. In the Latitude test, this camera scored 9 stops of latitude, which is fantastic. It's on par with many high-end cameras like the Red Raptor X, for instance. And so actually I was really surprised how well it performed in the lab in terms of sensor qualities, image. It's also the noise of that sensor has a very organic quality, and it's preserved very well in the image pipeline. So I was actually super tempted that this could be my next camera for my personal use case.
You know what I always find interesting about Sony? We all know that they're one of the few sensor manufacturers that are making a lot of this. They're making all the sensors themselves, and they're also selling it to other manufacturers. And of course, we never know. Like, we can just assume based on your tests and so on if there is a Sony sensor in the camera or not. But it almost feels like they always try to put, when they have a new sensor only every couple of years, they always put it in one of the top photo models first, and then it trickles down over the years. And then we probably see the same sensor or a similar version of that sensor with different processing in, like you said, filmmaking cameras in the near future, hopefully. I mean, it's really overdue to see, for example, a new version of the A7S, which is still version 3. I think it's now 5 or 6 years old. Which is the same sensor that they use in the FX3, FX6, and so on. And also those cameras are absolutely due to be replaced, I think. But they are still selling well, I'm sure. But it's time for something new in that field. And that, I mean, maybe something based on this sensor or that same sensor in a different. I mean, it's not dual base ISO, I think, but still.
No, it's only single based.
But
also the native ISO is rather high. I think it was ISO 2000 or so.
Yeah. But
which makes it maybe more complicated to shoot, but so what? Use ND filters.
Exactly, right. Now they have the technology we know from the Burano to actually, but they always said they are not putting ND filters. Like I think, I mean, always the having a sensor stabilization inside a body was never possible to have in combination with a built-in ND until we saw the Burano, which has both, right? So theoretically, in the future, we could see that maybe also in an alpha if it doesn't become too big, or maybe there is a high-end version or something, We'll see. But that problem seems to be resolved. So it is possible to put both in one camera. We will see how big that camera can be. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, definitely. It seems like this is a new sensor, and it's the first time it's being implemented. So I'm sure we'll see other Sony cameras in the future that use the same or similar sensor.
Hopefully, because for me, this was really the dawning of a new age, actually, basically, of sensors that we see in consumer cameras. And I'm actually waiting to see this in other cameras, like you say. And this would be a fantastic camera for me, being a wildlife filmmaker. No? And it was surprisingly good, and maybe even that's sort of a company always positions itself and has a roadmap of product releases, and so maybe they are well aware how good this sensor is for filmmaking, but they still want to sell their model range and then slowly but surely make it available in other models. To maximize their turnover and profits, which is fine. They need to finance R&D and everything, of course. Every company is doing that. But this is, for me, wow. This was really huge to see that in a consumer camera.
Yeah, if I need to make a prediction for 25, I think we will see a Sony cinema camera that uses this sensor. One or two, actually.
I hope it also opens the door for higher frame rates, because so far we sort of only, in brackets, we have seen 4K 120 frames per second so far. But if it's a global shutter, basically, what is the reason you cannot have 4K 240 in such a camera, for instance?
Why is that? Because the rolling shutter would
limits the amount of frames you can read. No? So it's basically within 1 second, 1000 milliseconds, you have to read all the frames. If you want to read 240 frames per second, the rolling shutter has to be lower than 1000 divided by 240. That's 4 milliseconds or something.
Which is why all those super high-speed cameras like the Phantoms are actually using
Yeah.
a global shutter. CCDs often still, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this could be some of the things we see next year. Higher frame rates, utilizing a global shutter.
Interesting.
That would be super, super interesting.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, let's quickly move on to the rest of the cameras. So we also do the Red V-RAPTOR X 8K.
Yeah.
Now I think Red in the past was always a company that was very much on the, let's put it this way, overestimating their dynamic range, right? In terms of their claims. But this camera was actually a very positive surprise, right?
Yeah. No, actually, in general, I have to say the Red cameras were always very good in terms of dynamic range. There was just a big discrepancy to the claims.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. They still were very good. And it's always about how you read the waveform chart. You can also argue, I see some additional stops. I still see some stops in the noise floor and something. Yeah, but you have to make an objective assessment of it, not just talk about what you see or might not see. And this is why we have the standardized test and the exposure latitude test and so on. But both Red cameras that we tested, the Commodore X and also the Raptor X 8K VV, performed very well actually in our lab test. They only, like for instance, the Red Raptor 8K X VV is a full frame camera, and our benchmark so far was the Arri Alexa Mini LF, also full frame, and it scored 10 stops in our exposure latitude, and the Red scored 9 stops with some room towards 10, so it's getting close, still a little bit behind the Arri, but Arri is our benchmark since many years. No? So really good cameras. And also the Commodore X, quite surprising for us, was not actually on a rather similar level because the previous generation, the original Commodore, was about a stop worse. And it was also claimed by Red that this new X version has vast amount of improvement in the image quality, but also the audio side. So I think it's a very, very nice upgrade from the original Commodore. And also this one scored very well. And of course, you have to mention the Red codecs. Always were a superb added value of these cameras.
Just to have the ability to have different raw compression ratios is a very huge advantage over basically all the other manufacturers.
It's a fantastic codec, and also the frame rates that these cameras offer, like the Red Raptor X offers up to 4K 240, 8K 120. Wow, and cropping into the image, which is also good for wildlife photographers. But for my hobby, I cannot afford such a camera.
Moving on to the Burano. So that was kind of like the gap filler of Sony between the FX9 and the Venice 2, which is a big gap. So they came out with this $25,000 camera. Is it... it has a lot of the innovation I already mentioned is really having a variable ND in combination with an actual IBIS in body, which we haven't seen from anybody else before because it was always claimed that it's not possible. This camera is E-mount with a detachable PL mount, essentially. So both kind of native mounts. Box-shaped, kind of a little bit bigger, I guess, than a Komodo. But and finally also recording on CF Express Type B, and it can record RAW internally. Now, how did it perform, and what do you make of this camera?
Basically for me, this camera seems to be a very well-rounded package. Price is a different story, but very well-rounded. But don't expect wonders in the dynamic range department. I think this camera is really geared towards resolution. 8K resolution. It has very little internal image processing in terms of noise processing or so. And this is why it retains very high resolutions and very fine details also. But it scores like the typical 12 to 13 stops that all the other cameras also score. If you look at our lab test, we shot at various resolutions, raw codecs, internal 10-bit compressed codecs, and so on. I think it offers a solid dynamic range, but don't expect wonders. It has 8 or even 9 stops of exposure latitude, so also the image pipeline has been improved, but the sensor is still like the standard, I would call it standard 12-bit readout mode technology. There's one catch with this camera, and that's the rolling shutter. So unfortunately, and compare that to the Venice that you mentioned, the Venice 2's 8K scored best in our rolling shutter department for rolling shutter sensors. It scored less than 2 milliseconds. Sony Burano scored 18.9 milliseconds.
Which is actually a
And that
very
is,
strange result for
huge.
a high-end cinema camera, right?
Yeah.
That, I mean, the funny thing is we've received a couple of, like messages from people who bought the camera who were disappointed about this result. Also, even before we released this, because they were surprised. There was this, and also the fact that it seems to have some infrared pollution.
Yeah.
Which is also interesting. So there was a bit of we still don't know what exactly was going on, but when the camera was released, something happened and some units were called back and something was, I don't know. We don't know. But
I think it's always difficult on a sensor level, these OLPF filters that are used to cut infrared pollution and also moire and stuff. This is a long and expensive tuning process. That's why Blackmagic never did it. Save for the Pyxis now and the Cinema Camera 6K, which can use the standard OLPF filter in front of the sensor that also the Lumix cameras use. So sort of somebody else has gone through the optimization cycles. It looks like with this camera, they still needed to optimize that with the infrared pollution and everything. No?
So I mean it's on paper, if you look at the question is, it's like on paper you see this is the first Sony camera below the Venice that can actually record a light version of RAW internally. Even none of the other FX cameras can do that, and none of the Alphas can do it yet. But we're seeing this on Canon side. We're seeing it with the R series. We're seeing it with the Cinema series, the EOS Cinema on Canon side, and of course Blackmagic and so on.
Even the Lumix GH7
Lumix
can now record internally.
So this is really something where Sony is now the last.
Yeah.
And with a huge installed user base that Sony has, which is arguably a lot bigger than most of the others, it's really time for them to step up. It in that regard. And this camera, I think, would have been extremely successful if it was 10,000 less.
Yeah.
Because for 15,000, I think a lot of people would have bought this camera. I guess they didn't want to cannibalize, I don't know what, like the FX9 doesn't seem to be a camera that, like it hasn't been updated in a very long time. FX6 is also getting more love in terms of firmware updates. Yeah. So it's kind of end of life for FX9, I guess. Unfortunately, I say that as a FX9 customer. But yeah, so yeah, I think they can do better here, and I hope they will do better in the future. I don't know how much of these results can be improved with firmware. I don't know.
No, I think that these are hardware limitations that we see.
Yeah.
I mean, sensor readout, rolling shutter, I think there's not much you can do. That's sort of a genuine hardware thing on a sensor level, how fast you can read it.
Having said that, it's a good package. It's a really great form factor, I
all
think.
these cameras are fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a very high level here, but if you compare, you have to compare them at some point also on just purely on the sensor level. I think these results are very clear.
I think they're using their market position. No?
Yeah.
It's a lot of people have switched over to Sony in the past, using probably their glass, mount glass as well. And
absolutely. Good. Let's move on to the second to last camera we tested this year. It's the GH7, which is, of course, you come from the GH line, right?
Yes.
That's one of the first
I bought
cameras.
one of the first GH1s in Japan. It still had a Japanese menu. I didn't care because I thought that I can still read the numbers in the menu, but it was difficult. But then a firmware hack came, which was able to use the English version. But GH1 is a long time ago. Now we have the GH7. Fantastic camera. I'm always again and again surprised how well these cameras perform actually. It's a micro four third sensor, so it's like 4 times smaller than a full frame sensor. It still has 25 megapixels, so 6K or 5.8K readout modes are available. And you would typically expect that hampers dynamic range. And in this case, Panasonic has implemented per default this dynamic range boost technology, which sort of gives you one stop in addition by combining 2 different gain levels on a sensor. And it scores very well. It is actually in the range of typical consumer full-frame cameras. So a sensor 4 times as smaller than a full-frame sensor has the same results than some of the full-frame sensors. And for instance, we talked about the Sony A7S III, which is aging 5 to 6 years old. This camera scored worse.
Yeah.
1 stop less in the Latitude section, for instance. So a recent for thirds sensor can be better, 1 stop better than a full-frame sensor that is out there for a long time.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting, I mean, before it came out, a lot of people were actually doubting that there would be a GH7 because, of course, like the question always is, are there
Micro Four Thirds?
Micro Four Thirds, does it still have a future? Yeah. We see Blackmagic moving on from this.
Full frame.
Olympus is out of the game, kind of. So it's not that much done in that field anymore, but they, of course, have their advantages. Especially, for example, wildlife or anything where you need longer focal lengths, it's a huge advantage. And then one thing I also found with Panasonic cameras in general, and I think I've talked about it before, I've used this camera, 4 of them actually in a recent car show, and we decided for that because it has the best sensor stabilization by far.
Yeah,
and it performed extremely reliably. Never had any issue in terms of, and finally autofocus is good.
Yes,
right.
Yes,
so they finally have figured out the autofocus too, and then also of course the image in general. I mean, it's really if you don't care about, you don't always need a larger sensor. And I think it's almost like people are fetishizing, including us, this large sensor thing. But there is, sometimes it's not useful. Sometimes it makes sense.
Also, what you have to say is, I mean, put a Metabond speed boost on it. There's the 0.64 speed booster available, the XL. And then you get like an APS-H sensor size, 1.28 crop factor.
Yeah.
You can use your full frame lenses, everything, and you have a fantastic camera. And you gain more than a stop of light, 1.3 stops of light you gain.
Incredible.
With that.
And also, of course...
So also in low light, then no problems. I mean, superb.
And if I think if you're shooting in a small package, if you want to travel lightly, it's a big case to be made for smaller sensors in general.
And for instance, I mean, I'm using the GH6 with the XL speed booster and the Sigma 18 to 35. It becomes a 22 f1.1 lens.
Wow.
With a crop factor of 128. It just covers the lens.
Yeah.
And you have a fantastic zoom lens with a factor of 2, super fast.
And the reason why people always said,
it's a small package. What else do you need?
Yeah, and the reason why people always said, I don't want to use full frame also because of the sensor is not as good as a full. But now you see that it is better than some of the full frame sensors.
Actually, my wish would be, please Panasonic, put this dynamic range boost technology in a new full frame sensor.
Yeah.
I mean, how good would that be? But let's see what the year 25 brings.
Let's see what it will bring.
But it's the GH7, fantastic camera, superb results in the lab for Micro Four Thirds. Still on par, it plays with the big boys, full stop.
Yeah. The thing, I think a lot of people will just look at the price though, and then they will compare it to the S5 2X, which is, I think, same price or very similar.
S5 2X, it is also around 2,000 or so, 2,200.
So, I mean, it's not similar. Expensive, but it's like people on paper will compare it to the full frame camera from the same manufacturer and be like, why is this the same price? But, you know, like horses for courses.
But also, I mean, you get a fantastic 4K 120 mode with the GH7, and it's the best 4K 120 mode I have seen so far in any camera.
Yeah.
So again, if you need high frame rates, the smaller sensor, Micro Four Thirds, delivers with a superb 10-bit 422 4K 120 mode, full sensor mode. So again, for wildlifers, this is a fantastic camera.
Nice. They definitely tried to put all the technology they have to put into this small thing. It's incredible. Okay. Last but not least, the last camera lab test that we released this year was your URSA Cine 12K LF lab test. Now, of course, that is Blackmagic's real attempt to enter this high-end, this coveted high-end market, which I think is it's just crazy. They're crazy in many ways, like in terms of like the things they're trying to disrupt in the industry. This is probably the hardest part of the industry to disrupt because essentially people want to buy security when they are. That's why it's so hard to beat ARRI, because essentially, the price of a camera is not essentially the deciding factor on a movie set. It has to work. It has to work reliably.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of it has to work, that was not always the best reputation that Blackmagic had in the past, right? In terms of reliability of their cameras. We saw long time ago, cameras that were, the image deteriorating when it got hotter, essentially, with sensor patterns and stuff like that. Also some reliability issues in the past, but they still decided to go into this. They've enhanced a lot over the years, of course, with recent cameras. And now they're really entering this market with a camera that costs $15,000, which is, for them, it's very high end. However,
what this camera offers.
What does it offer for this money? If you compare it to Sony with a Burano, for example, or whatever. So what's your verdict on this camera?
Absolutely amazing, fantastic. The specs it offers. I'm not talking about 12K resolution, because I'm not sure we have lenses that can resolve 12K. But okay, fine. Looking at the lower resolutions like 8K or 4K readout, you can go up to 4K, 220 frames per second. And if you look also at the rolling shutter, open gate, 12 milliseconds of rolling shutter, which is fantastic.
In this crazy high resolution.
High resolution with 100 megapixels. We talked about the FUJIFILM camera before.
Yeah.
Medium format, 100 megapixels with 26 milliseconds. This has 12 for the full sensor, not even 17 by 9, but open gate. Yeah.
Incredible.
So absolutely amazing. And
so the processing actually in there must be
super
massive.
Fast. Massive, but also super fast. And again, if you go down to 8K resolution, you get 5.5 milliseconds.
Wow.
And this is
it's almost like global shutter.
It's almost like global shutter already now. It's fantastic. Fantastic. And also then dynamic range results don't disappoint. Looking at native sensor resolution, 12K, we get 13 stops at signal to noise ratio of 2. This is a superb result.
In open gate.
This is not far from an Alexa Mini LF, also full frame sensor, no? That got in ARRI RAW, Mini LF got 13.4 stops at signal to noise ratio of 2. And then we did just a little fun thing and scaled down the 12K image to 4K and make it comparable to the ARRI Alexa Mini LF.
But makes sense,
Makes sense now, because if you compare
it's a
4K
4K
to 4K,
camera, the Mini LF.
Then if you downscale the full 12K image, you get on par results with the Alexa Mini LF. With the IMA test and Xyla test. But again, the Latitude, that is considering everything from the sensor to the image pipeline to the codec, we actually find it has 1 stop less than the Alexa Mini LF.
So the king is still
on
the throne.
The king is still on the throne for full frame cameras. But it is a fantastic result. It's also the best result we got for any Blackmagic camera so far. And earlier versions of the 12K sensor, they had it in the Super 35 model, for instance, for a while. They were always hampered. Also in the past, it was a problem by fixed pattern noise, horizontal, vertical stripes in the image. But this sensor now in full frame doesn't show any of that. So it's got a very nice organic noise. You can underexpose heavily. Yeah, it's all in all a fantastic package for the price. And I also like it that they give this media dock.
Yeah. You like the media dock?
Yeah. Because
Johnny is really, of course, it's right now they only have 3. I think this media dock where you can actually put in 3 of those, so it's quite big.
Yeah, actually, maybe I misspelled it. I'm not talking about the media dock itself, but to have the option that it can record internally on this specialized media. There's like this 8 terabyte SSDs inside, or NVMe.
And they in their own way kind of solved this problem, right? They removed this bottleneck by just developing their own media.
Exactly.
Now we only just need a way to simply connect that without a reader by USB or something.
You can use this Ethernet connector.
You can use the camera itself.
You can have USB-C on the camera, and you have also the Ethernet port. And the Ethernet, you can have an adapter, and that's also practical, I would say. And that's much faster than the USB-C.
Yeah.
So I'm really impressed what they pulled together in terms of rolling shutter, dynamic range results, codecs, frame rates. Wow, this package is absolutely unbelievable, but it's high end. Yeah, I wouldn't carry around this camera
Yeah.
for my wildlife adventures. But as usual, every use case has its own needs for a camera, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people production houses, whatever, will jump on this camera.
I think the Trojan horse for Blackmagic design is often their DaVinci Resolve and their whole post-production pipeline.
Sure.
And when everything is already on, if you're using ATEMs and all their switches and stuff, and then it's so nicely integrated. And,
superb.
And the only question is, I mean, will this be, maybe high-end multicam production or something? I don't know. I think entering this high-end, they really want to go for the cinema market. That's just a tough one. It's just a tough one to get into.
Huge entry barrier.
Exactly. And there's this niche for red still, where there are, of course, a lot of films also shot on red. But yeah, I wonder. I mean, Panasonic has failed in this market, right? Mm-hmm. Canon has failed with the C700. We'll probably never see a successor to that camera. The VariCam doesn't exist anymore. So there's really only Alexa, then there's red, and that lower down is the Venice, Sony Venice. Is there more room for a very struggling high-end market, which was suffering from strikes and all those things? That is, production has shrunk. So let's see. I mean, I wish them the best.
Maybe that's not the target. Maybe they are targeting like people that come from like mirrorless, whatever.
But it's a very heavy, very, very big
and
camera.
Now want to sort of up their game in filmmaking. I don't know.
Maybe we'll see. I hope it will be successful.
But I mean, the price-performance ratio of this camera, fantastic.
Of course, yeah,
amazing.
Course. But still, I mean, that's it. You read on paper, 15,000 people have come to expect inexpensive Blackmagic cameras, right?
Yeah.
So, but the results are amazing. They did their homework. Let's see, and if you compare it like really next to the offerings of the competitors, and the Burano comes to mind immediately, which is like 10,000 more. Yeah, this delivers actually a lot more.
Or it's on par with the Commodore X in the lab test. I mean, not talking about all the other aspects of the camera, but
yeah, of course. I mean, you're still lacking autofocus and stuff like that. That
of course,
some of the higher end other offerings now have, like Sony. But yeah, good. I mean, that wraps up the lab test we've released this year. Just very briefly, what's your outlook for 2025 in terms of like sensor technology?
Yeah, I'm very curious to see what we get. Because as I mentioned already in some of the articles, I got a bit bored testing these standard 12-bit readout sensors because you always get the same results. So I'm really hoping that we will see more of the global shutter technology. We'll see more maybe of 14-bit readout modes for video sensors. That would again up the game. And I also do hope for higher frame rates. I mean, 4K 240, for instance, that would be huge.
We haven't tested a lot of low ends in terms of like smartphones and stuff like that. Is there anything in this field where you think can be done in terms of image quality?
Yeah, I mean,
or are you very limited by?
It's of course you're limited by the pixel pitch. You're limited by the small sensor sizes and everything. It's of course all the research money probably, or the big budgets go into that.
Yeah.
So we will definitely see massive improvements there as well. But at one point. The question is, how far can you push it with all these tricks and noise reduction? There's still sort of a physical limit of a pixel size, but who knows what technology brings?
Yeah. And do you want to get a little bit of a tease of what are the next lab tests we will release?
Yeah, basically the C400 exposure latitude test is still open. Although, I mean, it looks like everything is very similar to the R3 that we tested already. So let's see if it is on a similar level or better. Then we have the R5 Mark II coming up as well. And some other stuff we're not allowed to talk about yet, right?
Right. All right. Thank you, Gunther. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We'll do this again at some point.
Yeah,
and
thanks for having me.
Very looking forward to the next lab tests. And thanks everybody for watching. Again, if you are interested, last but not least, I just want to show you very briefly the actual databases. So we are putting the results of the lab tests also in the camera database. So you have to log into CineD, to have access to all the functions here, but it's of course just a normal free sign up. And then every one of the cameras that has a lab test done has this little lab label here, and you can just click on it, and it just, I mean, the C400 results are in there yet. We don't have the lab test article yet, but for example, and then you see all the results here. You can check the ranking in terms of dynamic range, for a signal to noise ratio of 1 and 2. And then, of course, all the rating for rolling shutter as well. We also have Florian in our office, who you've probably met in another episode of the podcast. He's actually checking all the recording modes of a camera. And that's very complicated because it literally means you need to open every combination of frame rate and resolution and codec that a camera records.
It's huge. Yeah.
Is huge, and it will end up here in this database. And you see it's like crazy how many of those. That's just one camera. That's just a C400. And you see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of modes, and they're all in here, and you couldn't search for them. So this is also there for each camera.
That always happens now when we publish a lab test with one of these modes, typically the best mode in RAW or whatever.
Yeah.
People always ask, but how about this other mode? Yeah.
And Florian spends days doing these things.
Yeah.
And on our camera database, you can also compare to other cameras. So for example, I could compare this result to a Canon C300 Mark III, for example. Or let's do the C500 Mark II, because that's actually also full frame camera. And then you can compare the C400 to the C and all the results that we got for those cameras in the lab test and so on. So you will immediately see the strengths and weaknesses in terms of the dynamic range, rolling shutter results, and so on. So yeah, good. But
great.
Yeah, thanks Gunther.
Thanks, Nino.
Thanks everybody for watching. Please give us a good rating on on your favorite platform where you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever. Don't forget to also leave a comment, send us questions to podcast@cined.com, and see you next week. Thanks.
Thank you.